right. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. We'll let people come in. See the numbers ticking up. That's great. We'll give everybody a couple minutes. Thanks everyone who's joined so far. Let's give another minute or so and we'll get going. Okay. All right, well, with three passed, so I'm going to start getting going here. And as people come in, they can join us. Thanks, everybody who has joined already. Very excited again for another edition of the Proximity Lab Design Conversation Series. I'm Scott Sania, VP of Design at Proximity Lab. We are a UX research strategy and design agency. We were founded many years ago, 2007. We've been around a while in New Hampshire. We specialize in complex data-driven digital products. We have clients like Adobe and Microsoft and CVS. And so we do a lot of product work, a lot of client relationship building. And so today's conversation is near and dear to my heart because it's really about how to work with those people. And it really is, it's such a huge key in my experience to designer success, client success, and business success. So we're talking to Tom Greever today, and I'm very excited about it. But before I actually formally introduce Tom, I just did want to have talk about a couple notes for today's format. This is a Q&A discussion, so I'll be talking with Tom in a Q&A type discussion, but you're all on the call welcome to add Q&A questions to the conversation. I may not get to all of them, but in your Zoom window, you should see an area where you can put those in and you can upvote questions you want answered. We will also be recording the event, so that's always asked of us. The answer is yes, we are going to do that. So we will indeed be recording and you can get to it afterwards. So with all that, I would like to now introduce our guest, Tom Greever. Tom's been designing interfaces and leading design teams for over 20 years. And he's, of course, the author of the fantastic, very influential book that I have carried around with me for many years. We're on the second edition now, but many years ago, it's been influential for a long time. And it's the basis for today's talk. We're going to have a free-ranging conversation, but really articulating design decisions in Tom's book is the basis for today's talk. So I'm very excited to welcome Tom. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm glad to be here. It's going to be a fun talk, I know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just kick us off with our questions here. This topic, I said it was near and dear to my heart. It really is true. I've been doing this a long time as well, and I'm fascinated by this topic, mostly more from an agency standpoint. So my lens comes from like being in a design agency, and it feels like the stakes for designers to be able to speak to stakeholders the way you talk about in your book is so high. The stakes are so high in an agency setting. Not that it's not in-house, but it feels like, from an agency side, what I've seen in my experience is that you really can make or break a relationship with a client. If you can't articulate yourself or manage the relationship well. So I've just always found it to be such an incredibly important thing for designers to be able to do. It's so crucial. So that's kind of the lens that I come at it from, and why I've always been fascinated by this topic, by your book. I've thought endlessly about it. If anybody's on the call who knows me, in my past, they know we've talked about this ad nauseum. some of these topics. So I'm just really excited to talk to you about it. But I wanted to kind of kick us off by just getting, having you tell us about your lens to this and what made you so interested in this that you wrote this book about it many years ago.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I share that sentiment. I think I spent about half my career in consulting agency side
Mm.
or doing even freelance work, right? And the other half on internal teams. And so I've kind of seen both sides of that. And you're absolutely right. When you're on that, kind of contractor agency consulting side, it really can make the difference between like getting work and not getting work. Whereas internally can definitely have a big impact on you as well, but it's just not exactly the same as when like your next check might literally depend on, some of these skills. Um, I think as far as like how I came into this, I think it's safe to say that early in my career, I was not really astute enough to understand just how important some of these things were. I was working on internal teams. I think perhaps arrogantly, I saw my ideas as better than other people's ideas. I felt like I was the expert and other people weren't the expert, right? I think I probably didn't make too many friends in those early days and the teams that I was on. But at one point in my career, my wife and I moved to China, and we were living in China for about 4 years. And in that process, I was working on some software. I was also pursuing a graduate degree in cross-cultural communications. And it's just a very different world when you live, and this was a long time ago. So China was, sort of even less Americanized than it is today. And we were in a little bit more of a rural area. And so it really was one of those moments where understanding cultural nuance and communicating with other people, I mean, just it impacts whether your ability even to eat at a restaurant that day, right? Like, I mean, you really
Right.
have to kind of like learn a lot more about relationships and culture and kind of how all of that works. And that was eye-opening for me to see just what a large role those relationships and that communication played in that process. So when we came back to the United States, I started to put all of this together and realized that, the big difference between some of the designers that had been on my team that maybe weren't quite as successful as kind of, getting their work approved or moving things forward, that big difference really was their ability to understand and communicate with other people, right? Like to see those cultural nuances, to appeal to other people's needs, right? To explain their work to someone else in a way that made sense to the other person as opposed to them, right? That those were the skills that really set you apart. And it was so much less about, just those, your craft, right? Not that craft isn't important. It absolutely is, but craft without those skills of articulating design decisions, it makes it a lot more difficult for you to get anywhere, right? And so as I started putting that together, and then especially as I started building up my next few teams and kind of like moving forward in my career a little bit more, I started to kind of hone in on like, well, what are the things that we're doing well, right? What are the things, what do we find ourselves doing over and over again? Where are the patterns? Like how could I simplify this in a way that I could teach it to
Mm.
people on my team or to other people that we worked with? And that ultimately culminated in the things that you see in the book. It was my attempt to kind of distill it down into a set of either principles, and there's a couple of things that might be clarified as like a framework, right? An approach to a certain
Hmm.
problem, right? If I could come up with solutions for those patterns, then it would be easier for all of us to kind of replicate that going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, makes sense. And there's so much of that in here, and I want to get to some of the tactical things, and we'll also talk about some of the other things you touched upon there, maybe even people management and learning from your own past, and growing and what it means to grow into this role, because a lot of what you talk about is a senior level. I mean, you can learn it from day one, but there's a certain senior level feel to it. But um, one of the things you talk about that I think is incredibly important from a framework standpoint, from a teaching standpoint, is the idea. I mean, there's many, but the idea of listening. Um,
Mm.
I've always just, I don't, I don't know exactly how you teach listening, and maybe we can touch on that. But I think you do touch on it to some degree. It's really an innate skill, but that idea of like hearing what isn't being said, I've always found to be so hugely important in these situations. Um, for those who haven't read the book, obviously not everybody has. Can you just outline and talk a little bit about some of the tactics you put in there for better listening?
Sure. Yeah. So I kind of divide them into two categories, implicit listening and explicit, which sometimes is referred to as either passive or active listening. It's just a
Mm,
slightly different take on that. But the implicit ones are things like, being sure you give them the time and space to talk as much as they need to. It could be that what you said, hearing what isn't being said, right? Thinking more about the problem that they're trying to solve rather than the solution that they're proposing is a big one, especially in design. And then like practicing what I call the art of the pause. That is like not kind of jumping into a defensive response, giving allowing there to be enough time and space after they're done talking. And sometimes if that feels a little uncomfortable, you can say something simple like, well, let me think about that for just a minute, right? And often just the time it takes to say those words and have a brief pause is enough to both allow them the time and space to make sure they were heard and also for you and kind of your brain to catch up a little bit. Those are the implicit ones. The explicit ones are again more outward facing, right? So it's harder skills like making sure that you're taking good notes, writing things down, right, and creating that documentation about what you heard, um, being sure to be responsive and in asking a lot of questions, right, and making sure that you understand, even if the purpose of it is to repeat it and rephrase it back to them to give them the confidence that you understood what they were saying, right? Because that's an important part of it too. And I think sometimes, we hesitate to do that because you don't want to be naturally, you don't want to be repetitive. You don't want to waste time, right? But at the same time, it is helpful to give that person
hmm
confidence that you understood them by repeating it and rephrasing it back to them. So those are some of the tactics that I mentioned in the book. But I think all of them are learnable. I
Yeah.
agree that some people seem to have this more naturally than others. But things like focusing on the problem that they're trying to solve as opposed to the solution, that's something I can consciously make myself aware of, even if I'm not naturally inclined to think that way. Same with
Yeah.
writing down, creating documentation. Let's not get fixated on creating perfect documentation or the right kind of documentation, but just start writing. I mean, anything I write down is going to be valuable, right? Even if I can improve my skill in that, over time to become either, more efficient or being able to take better notes, right? So I do think these are things that we can practice, even if we're
Yeah.
not inclined to just kind of naturally know or practice those things on our own.
Yeah. And I think also those are great. And listening just, I think, fosters trust as well. In my experience, I mean, you talk about trust a lot in the book. I think it's obviously a key factor with any relationship, but certainly with stakeholder relationships, you're trying to build trust. And when a client or stakeholder or anybody feels that you're actively listening to them, I think that fosters a sense of trust as well, which kind of brings me to just the general sense of um, being people being human, being human to each other and having empathy for each other. And you talk a lot about that, which I love. Can you talk a little bit about just remembering, in those moments where you were maybe difficult, that a stakeholder could have something going on in their lives, or that they're human, and if there's a lukewarm response to your concept, like what are some things that you can tell yourself and remind yourself of in those moments?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm frequently telling my own teams is that if you're ever confused by someone's response, like it just doesn't reconcile with what you know to be true about them or the project or whatever, then there may be something else going on. And we don't really have to know what might be going on, but sometimes just having an understanding that there are other things happening, in the background, off to the side that are influencing this person, right? So when I think about someone who might be lukewarm when they would normally be excited or maybe I would expect them to be supportive given the circumstances and the context, but now they're not. It's a pretty good chance that there's just something else going on. And, so the first answer to your question is like, just that alone is often enough to cause you to like not feel like, you've made some sort of mistake or that like you've missed that opportunity, right? And so either you can ask good questions, right? Just kind of like try to understand their perspective. This is in the context of empathy, right? And so sometimes I've asked people in that sort of context, like, hey, how does this project
Yeah.
affect you and your job, right? Like where does this thing that we're talking about sit in amongst all of the other priorities and things that you're working on, right? And kind of give them permission to deviate from that KPI or company goal or like whatever the official line is, but just ask them, no, for you as an individual, how does this affect you? And you get some pretty interesting answers. And I have in the past, people say, oh, well,
Mm.
I was told I had to cut the budget because of this. And so I'm really stressed out that if we don't deliver this tomorrow, then we're going to do, and it's like, okay, well, that fully explains why this person is now suddenly rushing me on something that I thought we had agreed to take more time on. Right. Now
Yeah.
in that case, I can't always fix it for them. Right. I can't necessarily just decide to move forward with some half-baked idea, but it at least gives me the empathy to understand where they're coming from. And often just acknowledging that, like, I understand how difficult this is for them, right? So, sometimes
Hmm.
just demonstrating that we know what's important to them, right? That's enough to cause them to feel heard and listened to, and therefore more receptive to whatever, concept or idea I may be trying to propose.
And how might you tell people who, so it feels like that makes total sense to me, but I feel like not everybody's always in that position to be able to maybe do that to perhaps the decision holder in a meeting, or if it, especially if it's an exec level person who's giving you the problem. Um, how might a designer, who might be listening right now, who might say, I would love to be able to do that, but how do I do that, to somebody who's on this call, and I'm just, or, in person or whatever it is. Are there any tactics for that, or any ways to kind of like work it in more tactically while you're presenting or something like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I think a lot of people are accustomed to working in some measure of kind of like, icebreaker questions or,
Yeah.
let's take a break from this and, do something different, especially if you're doing something that's a little bit more like workshopy, right? I mean, we could brainstorm all
Hmm.
kinds of ideas, but it's totally possible to use like a whiteboarding tool to ask people to like rank their
Yeah. Yeah.
capacity, their, what's your mental capacity today for this meeting, like from low to high, right? Like
Yep.
you can gauge a little bit of sentiment even with a larger group or with a group that may have people that sit above you in the organization. I don't think we should be afraid to ask for help from others too, right? Our leaders are
Yeah.
there to help us with these conversations too. And I know that especially if someone on my team was having trouble with someone that was one of my peers or even above me, I would fully expect to engage with them and help them. But even aside from all of that, I mean, it does all boil down to trust and what other people, um, what their perception of us and kind of like the value that we bring is, and so much of that is built outside of those meetings. So like
Yeah.
your question kind of assumes that we don't already have some measure of, I shouldn't
Mm.
say it assumes, it doesn't really assume that, but I guess it's just worth clarifying. We do need to be sure we have some measure of goodwill built and relationship built up with them before we even get to that meeting, right? If
Right.
it's our first meeting, maybe it's a brand new client, we've never met them before, that's a totally different context. We should absolutely be looking for opportunities to get to know people on a different level and to understand what appeals to them so that by the time we do get to those meetings they're more likely to listen to us, right? So it's not
Yeah.
totally a binary thing. I think there's lots of opportunities for us to kind of build that empathy and that relationship over time.
Absolutely. So many, and they're all, I've always thought of it as this it's like a tapestry of little things, like little nuances here and there, how you handled this situation, how you handled that situation. Being positive, you mentioned that in your book, bringing a positive vibe to the situation, is always feels really important. If you are having, you talk about this, obviously, you talked about this a lot. Like if you are having a problem with a stakeholder, forget the level, forget whatever it is. It just happens to be a difficult thing. All of us struggle with difficult conversations. It's not easy to have a difficult conversation with someone. What are some tips that you might have for people who just have to have a difficult conversation? And it doesn't have to be in the context of a meeting, could be outside of that, or maybe that's the tactic, is to take it outside of a meeting.
Sure. Yeah. So there's two there's two types in my experience. Like one is just kind of like interpersonal like conflict, right? Like that's a difficult conversation. I think the kind of difficult conversation you're talking about is like, well, when it comes to this design or this product choice or this strategy, like we just fundamentally disagree on the way to go. Um, Obviously, if there's interpersonal stuff, that's a little bit different. But I'm going to focus on the second one here because I think that's maybe more relevant. I think when it comes to the solutions that we have to arrive at, it's natural that we're all going to have different ideas about how to do it. And so I actually like to tell people that I don't think there has to be a difficult conversation. Like I think we psych ourselves out when we use the
Mm,
word difficult, when we go into it believing that
yeah,
this person is going to disagree, that this is difficult, right? Any sort of negative language, and you already referenced that I focus a lot on trying to remain positive, right? And that's true in
yeah,
this case too. I think in some ways there's nothing more empowering than to go into a conversation believing that like we have different ideas about how to approach this. And there's this amazing opportunity for us to figure out what we think the right choice is
yeah,
given the constraints and the opportunity and the context. And we don't do ourselves any favor when we say things like best choice or right choice, which I did just now, right? And unintentionally, I think it's natural to use that kind of language. Instead, it's more like we need to frame it in terms of like what we think the outcomes are going to be, right? Like, well, if we make this choice, it will have this outcome. That's a very different way to frame up a conversation than just simply saying like, well, I think it should be done this way because that's the right way, right? Like, I mean, that's like a very, like, it'd be natural for the other person to get defensive because if yours way is the right way, their way is the wrong way, right? And so, again, I think if we can take it off of ourselves and our own personal opinions and biases, it becomes a lot easier to have a productive conversation. And when you get to that point, I don't think it has to feel difficult, right? I think we can make it feel a bit more natural, like two people just kind of like working through a problem, and not something that is like fundamentally about disagreement.
yeah. Totally. It's such a great point. That it often, especially the part about, it often, well, almost never is as bad or as difficult as you're imagining it's going to be. And to go in with a different mindset there is hugely empowering. You're right. We are getting a few questions, which is awesome, from people, and one of them is, I think, fits fairly well here, just in talking about meetings or talking to stakeholders. How The question is about any ideas you may have for pulling quieter stakeholders into a conversation, that may have, they're in the room, they're not giving, as much feedback. We've all had that happen, I think, and often, times, maybe sometimes down the road that person, you know comes up later with something that throws something off. So how would you do that? What are some ideas for pulling those stakeholders in?
Sure. Yeah, I've definitely had this experience, and there's a number of things that we can do. One is sending out like, the pre-read or like giving the teaser in
Yeah,
advance so that people have a chance to think about it before they show up. Two is to not feel the pressure to like make a definitive decision in the moment. Like we can always say, okay, these are the ideas, directionally, we think this is what we want to do. but like, let's give it a rest and let's, circle back tomorrow morning or later this afternoon or whatever, right? I'll send out a message and we can decide, just to give people time to catch up. Another big one for me that I like to do is to give people roles in my meetings, because most meetings, everyone shows up believing that they are equivalent in the conversation, that they all bring the same amount or kind of value, that it's just a free for all. It's like someone's going to present something and then anyone is going to be able to say anything that they want, right? And so sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes I like to give out specific roles and responsibilities in my meetings where I might say, hey, Scott, just so you know, like at this meeting, you're just an observer. Like I need you there because you need to know what's going on. And obviously, if you have a question or something important that needs to be interjected, like please feel free. I'm not going to stop you from talking, okay? But you need to know that like I really need to hear from Josh in this meeting because he's the person that I've been waiting for feedback on, and we kind of scheduled this meeting to be sure that he could contribute to this, right? And
Mhm.
people usually appreciate the opportunity to help
Yeah.
you like organize the meeting in that way. Sometimes I'll even just call on people, and if possible, I will tell them in advance that I might call on them. I don't want anyone to feel like thrown off or like put on the spot. But especially if I feel like the meeting is getting out of hand, there is that loud person who's just going to say a lot of stuff. They're kind of dominating the conversation. I will just pause and be like, okay, great. I really like to hear what Scott has to say about this, because I know he and I talked about it a few weeks ago and he's got some really great thoughts. So Scott, I want to be sure you have a chance to speak up. Now, I would always want to be sure that anyone in my meetings understands that it's totally fair for them to say, hey, thanks. I don't have like, I don't have a response. I don't have a comment, or pass on me for now. And maybe I'll come at like, we should all have permission to like be comfortable in the way that we give answers and not be put on the spot and risk saying something that like might actually not be a good choice, right? It might not be
Mm.
our best thought. And so I want people to be able to put their best foot forward if they can.
Yeah. So maybe holding on meetings for a minute. Another aspect I've found over the years is just so key that a lot of I where we're all running fast. It's tough to do when you're in a project, is to like design the meeting, but it's so hugely important to and it can mean so many things. To your point, you could assign roles, you could, but just having a general strategy. I look at it as, when I redesign the meeting, it's kind of like I just need a strategy going into how I'd like this to go. What do I need to get out of it? Feedback, plays a huge role. So I guess my first question there is just like, you talk about design the meeting in the book a bit. How do you design the meeting to get at the feedback you do want and not the feedback you don't want? I feel like that's an ongoing challenge for designers.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you alluded to this just now, which is
Yeah.
define like what is the goal for the meeting? How will I know that this was a good meeting? If I do nothing else beforehand, I should at least write down what I think that goal is. And most of the goals for design meetings end up being the same for me. There's only a handful, like maybe 5 or 6 tops. In
Mm.
fact, I should probably write down all of them and just copy and paste them, because it's almost always like keeping people in the loop, making a decision on X, getting
Yeah.
feedback on Y, right? Reviewing the plan for that. Like, I mean, I could probably go through all of them right now, right? Like, those just kind of like come back over and over again. If I can just identify what the goal is, and if the goal is feedback, then the next question is, okay, well, what kind of feedback do I
Yeah.
need? And I'll write that down and usually tell people up front, right? Like, hey, I'm looking for feedback on the interaction with this widget over here. Obviously, everything else is fair game in the sense that like I can't stop somebody from like having an idea, but I need you to know that like we're focused on this thing here, and that's where I really most need your feedback. Not only that, but I need to have a specific question to ask. Some of the worst design meetings that I attend are the ones where a designer presents something and then goes, any questions or any feedback? Like it's this
Right.
totally broad,
Right.
open-ended question. And maybe you don't know what kind of feedback people will give. And that's why we do that. And that's fine. But you do that, then you're going to get all kinds of random crap that may not be legitimately helpful to you. So you can make it easier for yourself by asking a specific question. And you only have to have one just to kick off the conversation, right? But if I
Right.
can present like what I want to present and then share like, okay, and so Scott, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think that the way this widget animates communicates what we talked about last week, trying to solve the problem of the conversion button clicky thing, right? Like, I mean, I can ask you a very specific question to kick off the conversation, and then hopefully that will take us down a path that is going to give me the kind of feedback that I want. But even when the conversation goes off the rails, I should be able to point back to an agenda, some document about the meeting to remind folks like, hey, thanks for sharing that. That's not why we're here today, right? We're here for
Right.
these three things over here. So I will write that down and I
Yeah.
won't forget it, but let's try to stay focused on the actual feedback that we came here to give.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's the onus of it is it's so easy. It is really easy. I mean, not even now to just say like, okay, what do you think? We looked at something, give me thoughts. And it is hard to be kind of rigorous enough with ourselves, I think sometimes to remind ourselves to say, to design that part of it, to say like, okay, what are we looking for feedback on, and how do have to go about telling the, the folks on the call or in the meeting um, how to get there? Because that's the
Yeah,
thing about what I find really interesting about all of this is your stakeholders and clients often don't know how any of this works. That's
right.
what I always, it's really kind of up to us as designers and practitioners to guide through this process.
That's
Um,
right.
what are your thoughts on that, and just in terms of like that accountability? I think I've felt over the years that it's always a little bit hard to express. Like you kind of get that you got to do that, but it's hard to express to others, how that's done, how to take account that type of accountability.
Yeah. So I think it mainly requires intentionality. I
Yeah,
think we all know that those things are important, that is part of the job, that, we do have to like, guide them and help them so that they know how to contribute.
yeah,
Um, and we're just simply not applying enough deliberate effort to the way that we think about it. Right. And so I like to make I mean, I love templates. I love frameworks. That's why I wrote the book, and there's some in the book,
yeah,
right? But um, because I know that we go from like design, 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 design to, oh, meeting minder popped up. I better switch over and share my screen and kind of wing it. And that doesn't have the level of intention that is really going to get me the best out of that conversation. Now, the good news is there's a sliding scale here, right? That the more intentionality and deliberate effort you put into something, the more you're going to get out of it. So even just having a little bit better deliberate effort
yeah.
is going to
Right.
pay for itself. Like it doesn't have to be perfect. And so that's why I create like a lot of like a meeting template is a great example. And we've already talked about several of the aspects of how you design that meeting, whether it's, the goal for the project and the goal for the meeting, and here's our agenda items, and here's the type of feedback that I want, and the type of feedback I don't want. I mean, I literally have a document with that outline in it.
Yeah,
I bookmark it. And when I go to that meeting, if I didn't have time to prepare, because I wasn't being as intentional as I needed to be, because let's face it, I don't do this perfectly either. Okay. Then I can hit that bookmark and open it up. And it serves as a little bit of a checklist where in the first few minutes of the meeting, I can go, oh yeah, what's the goal for the meeting? Hey, everyone, I'm glad we're here to talk about this thing. Real quick, I just want to be centered. The goal for the meeting is this. Is that right? Like we can actually work through that together. And even if it takes the first few minutes of the meeting, I think it'll pay for itself. And it exposes that kind of thinking to our partners, right? And to
yeah,
our clients, and helps them understand how we think about those things as well. So wherever you are on that spectrum, whether you're still kind of winging it, but trying to put in some better practices, or you have like kind of a well-oiled machine, like you're gonna see benefit kind of regardless of where you fall on that scale.
yeah. It's great, and along the lines of that intentionality, obviously, as you can. There's many things you could do with that, like lots of intentional things you could do. One of them that comes to mind is just explaining what we do sometimes. There was a question that came through. I actually see that, how how can you explain to a stakeholder or client what UX is, and how we can be most effectively used, how a UX practitioner can be most effectively used. Um, Maybe just getting beyond the feeling that a stakeholder might think of what we do as some sort of magical thing they don't understand, and kind of breaking it down into things that they do. Um,
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting question here. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot. So, a couple of things. One is just the vocabulary that we use, right? If we're using designy jargon that is not necessarily familiar to them, they might nod along and they'll understand the words, but it's not really going to
Right.
sink in, first of all. So, right, like I have found it to be helpful to talk about the work that I do in other terms that might be more useful for them. So instead of saying that, we're going to do contextual inquiry, which is, right over their head. It's like, I want to go to one of our customer sites and I want to watch them use our software, right? I mean, that's super simple. Like anyone can
Mm-hmm.
understand that, right? And we can talk about the benefits too, but like just finding simple ways to kind of like explain what we do. So there's definitely sometimes a language barrier, but more than that, it's not enough to tell someone what UX means or what it does or how they can get value out of it. If we're trying to convince them of that when they've already hired us or they have us on, like they already see some value, right? Or we wouldn't be there at all, right? So hey,
Mm-hmm.
thumbs up, like that's a win for us. But now the job is to not tell them that it's more valuable, but to just demonstrate it, right? And that's not to say that you can't talk about the value and looking for other areas where you can add value. Every job I've ever had, a significant percentage of it is about advocating for our craft. Yes, that is true. But I can't only do that, right? I have to take the initiative to find opportunities to demonstrate how we do it. I can't necessarily wait for permission. And definitely like client, project, your level in the organization, those things make a difference into how you approach it. But like in one of my most recent roles, we would talk a lot about the value of doing a certain kind of research. And finally was like, let's just go do it. Like, why don't we just like do it off to the side of the desk until we can like build some momentum, demonstrate the value of doing it that way. And as people see it, then they start to get it, right? And that's don't give, I mean, I don't want to trivialize it. It's hard to do in practice, especially if you don't have permission and you're kind of like doing it off on the side, right? That is definitely
Yeah.
something that's difficult to balance. But I do think that's ultimately how you get there. Like just saying the words is not going to be enough to get us where you're just going to then have to say those words again to the next
Right.
person after that person leaves the company and they hire someone else, right? You're
Yeah.
just going to have to say the
Yeah.
same things over and over again. So we can build in these patterns and practices that demonstrate it as well, and that's ultimately going to be more effective in the long term.
Mm. So transitioning a little bit to maybe how do we get there, right? So a couple questions have popped up, and I had some of my own as well, just around this is a lot, and it is a lot. I think running a project, dealing with stakeholders in that project, making sure the work outcome is the best it possibly can be, is an incredibly difficult job to do.
Yeah,
And I mean, I think that's why there's a book that you've written about it that people utilize, because it is really hard. So people have kind of brought up, if and I know this is hard to do, not to put you on the spot, but you know, thinking about it like baby steps, like how do I get from zero to somewhere further along the line? Like, what are the maybe three major things that I could just do right away to get better at this, to just get better at articulating my designs to a stakeholder, or just dealing with stakeholders in general?
sure. So since you asked me for three specific things, I'll answer that briefly. But then I want to talk a little bit more broadly about
Yeah.
the question. So three things you can do that are super practical. One, practice presenting more. And it can be as simple as like 5 minutes before the meeting, present it to yourself at your desk, in the bathroom, like wherever you need to go, verbally say the words out loud that you are planning to say in the meeting. Just that 5 minute practice will help you get better. You'll hear things that you didn't mean to say. You'll automatically kind of correct yourself. And that next time that you do it in the next meeting will be better. And then the better you get at practicing and the more you do practicing, the more formal your practices might be, right? The longer you'll get better at it, right? Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing is to just start writing stuff down, right? Like open up Notepad or text editor, and start writing. It could be your notes, it could be an outline, it could be just your train of thought, asking yourself questions like, what problem am I trying to solve for this? How is this going to impact our user? Why is this thing that I'm proposing better than all the other alternatives? So it could be your thinking, it could be the notes in the meeting, whatever. Start writing stuff down. Anytime you can translate the thoughts in your head to words on a page, the easier it will become for you to articulate those design decisions. And then the third thing is to focus on building relationships. Be intentional about finding those times and spaces to get to know people. Ask them about their pets and where they grew up and where they went to school and what kinds of food they like to eat. I mean, those things seem kind of trivial, but I think we underestimate just how important that stuff is at building rapport. Anytime you can demonstrate you have something in common with another person, even if it's just the weather, it
Mm-hmm.
goes a long way in building trust. So those are the three things. But I want to talk more broadly about this idea that like this is a lot to do potentially, right? And that's true. I often tell people I wouldn't want anyone to be overwhelmed by the content in the book. I mean, I lay out kind of like everything that I could think
Mm-hmm.
of for how to optimize it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about optimization, right? Like, of course, the more we can do, probably the better the outcome, right? But doing anything is going to be better than nothing. So like, don't get bogged down in this idea that like maybe there's too much to learn. I often compare this to other habits we need to build, like exercise, right? Like I've gone through plenty of seasons in my life where I was exercising more or less, or I had physical health goals or didn't. And every time I need to get back into that routine, it requires a lot of mental capacity. I've got to think about what I'm eating and when and what my exercises are and should I do these exercises or that? And am I doing cardio or weight training? And where are my clothes that I'm going to wear? And I need to set my alarm so I get up in the morning, right? I can think of all the different steps it would take and be overwhelmed by that. But instead, I recognize if I can just do one thing, I'm going to set out my clothes in the morning, overnight, so that in the morning when I get up, I can change clothes and go.
Mm-hmm.
Like just that is going to give me that step over time. All of those different steps start to become more automatic. They start to become more habitual until I'm not even thinking about them anymore. I'm automatically eating the things that I should. I'm doing the exercise. Not that it doesn't require effort, right? There's a reason a lot of us stop exercising over time, myself
Right.
included. But it's the same principle, right? That like we
Mm-hmm.
have to just be intentional about putting those things into practice. And over time, it requires less mental capacity.
Yeah. As a manager, if there, there might be managers listening, you're trying to coach to get from A to B and to help
Mm,
younger designers, less experienced designers be better at this. Um, One of the things that strikes me is those are all incredibly tangible things you can do, and they're fantastic, and it's true. And do you feel like there's an element that can you coach all of it? I guess. I mean, a lot of this feels like it might be maybe some people just aren't as good at speaking up. Maybe there's a social anxiety there. How do we coach people while still being inclusive to everyone?
yeah.
Everybody's differences.
Yeah, for sure. So there's two sides to this, in my opinion. Um, the first is where you're headed with this, which is like, yeah, in the interest of being inclusive and acknowledging that everybody's different,
Right.
we need to be accommodating to the different ways in which people engage and learn and contribute, right? And for me, as a facilitator of a conversation, that's easy because I feel like it's my responsibility to do that. And so I will naturally build in things, right? So we talked about whiteboarding earlier, right? If I have a whiteboard available to everyone on the meeting, even if we're not really using it for anything, but I can tell people, like, if you have a question or a thought or an idea, you put a post-it
Mm,
note on the whiteboard, right? Like we don't even have to talk about it during the meeting, but some like people are more comfortable doing that, right? Or like we said earlier, maybe we won't decide, and that way we'll give people a few hours to think about it and process it, and we'll come back later, right? So like as a facilitator, I can do those things. I'm happy to. um and in fact, I've seen the benefits of it on my own teams, right? Where we get better quality output when we accommodate the different styles and approaches that people have. So that 100%.
mm,
The other side of this coin, which is a bit more difficult to suss out, is that in most environments, facilitators aren't necessarily attuned to that kind of thing. They aren't necessarily empathetic to that, right? We definitely, at least in like kind of Western American culture, have our approach to doing meetings where people who are loud and can think quick on their feet and say things that sound smart tend to be the ones that dominate the conversation. Now, I'm not saying that's right. And we absolutely should always be working towards having some better practices to get the most out of the people on our teams, 100%. But it's almost like there's these two tracks of like living with reality while also kind of like pursuing a better path in the longer term. Right. And so on that side, where we have to deal with the reality that we're in right now, this moment, this meeting that we have to go to tomorrow, there is this measure of like, we all have to do things that we're uncomfortable with sometimes. We all need to grow and learn in other areas as well. And there are definitely upper and lower limits to that. But I think that we should be comfortable coaching, encouraging, maybe even challenging each other to work in some areas and doing things that we're less comfortable with. I know that I have plenty of gaps in my own experience. It's like, I don't really like working on that thing. I'm not good at that. It's really hard for me to do that. It's not a good use of my time, but I have to do that
Yeah.
sometimes, right? And we all have areas in our lives that are like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. And in talking to in managing people and talking to people, um, I mean, there's been talk lately, it feels like designers have definitely got a seat at the table, I think, in recent years, but there's also this conversation around product as well. I mean, does it feel like that there's a training aspect to it where designers can designers be trained better in this arena? Are product designers getting more trained? Like, do titles come into play here? Like, I don't know, is there a that you have in terms of like we should all be called product designers because they are seen as better at this sort of skill?
Yeah, I mean, there's a degree to which a title, especially if you have, executive level titles in an organization, that could be a proxy to some sort of commitment to valuing design and the ideas of design. Sure, I don't think that's always the case. I
Hmm.
mean, just as often, those could be vanity titles as much as anything, right?
Yeah,
Companies want to be able to say that they have those teams doing those things, even if it's still,
yeah,
just trying to maintain status quo. So I don't always put too much stock into that, although that can be an indicator, I think, of, but I'm not sure I answered your question. What was the question?
yeah. No, I think you did. I think there's just we talked to Christian Crumlish recently. I had a good talk with him, and there was just a discussion broke out about product designers versus just designers, and
Sure.
whether it mattered what to call ourselves in this day and age, and whether product designers were getting a better seat at the table to kind of have these sorts of conversations that we're talking about helping designers have. So it's just kind of
Yeah.
a discussion that's been out there a little bit.
Yeah, so this is just my personal take.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually don't think our titles matter nearly as much as what people think our titles mean,
Hmm.
right? So, if I'm working in an organization where UX is kind of like the term that people understand for whatever reason, it could be historical, right?
Yeah,
And I can talk about UX or UX design or UX research. Sure, then let's call ourselves UX designers and UX researchers because that's what like, but if we want to talk about a distinction between what the differences between UX and product, or even if you want to throw in kind of sub-disciplines like UI or whatever, okay, that's fine. We can get into those details like as an industry. That's fine. Like I think it's a valuable conversation to have. But for me on my individual team, I really only care whether or not my C-suite understands what titles we're using and why we're using them and what they mean. And as long as I have that shared understanding, we can call them just designers if we want, right?
yeah.
I don't think it matters quite as much as if we're not on the same page.
Right. I had mentioned, and you had said as well, like working in an agency, sometimes it's a little bit different. So for folks who might be doing that, what about on a project team makeup, whether you have this skill set as a designer. Maybe you're a senior designer, you have this skill set, but so does someone else on the team. Maybe the team makeup is, there's an account manager or client experience director or some other person who has been ascribed that role. So like how do you navigate that as a designer? Have you seen I mean, what's your experience with like kind of setting up teams for success, I guess, in the past for like project work?
It sounds like you're asking about like kind of having like a single point of contact to kind of manage the relationship, or kind of like the leader there.
Yeah,
And
like who's kind of who owns, what basically, right? On a project level. Because if what we're talking about here is to
yeah,
is to have designers be really great at managing the relationship with stakeholders, there are other team members that often have that in their skill set as well, or even in their
yeah,
job description. So I've always been frankly struggled with trying to kind of balance like who is the person who should be speaking, who is the person who should be leading this project or this meeting in
right.
that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a big advocate for both having a clear level of ownership at an individual level, as well as making sure that I can get visibility for as many people as possible on my team, right? I think it's possible to do both.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think it's so much about having one person who is a decision maker in that lead role. I mean, I don't think they're decision makers or authority figures as much as they are kind of like facilitators, and
Yeah.
kind of like the main point of contact, either in an agency client relationship or even internally on teams. I mean, it's pretty common to have kind of like project leads that facilitate the conversations between everyone else, right? So it's not a whole lot different. It's a little bit different. Um, but I think, and the individual on the other end of that conversation, maybe on the client side, for instance, makes a big difference too. There are some people that just are more comfortable with the person they know, right? And that's who they want to hear from. And like that message is just going to is going to come through better if it comes through the person that they trust the most. And other people aren't, quite as particular about that. So I think you kind of have to gauge what's most effective. I would definitely lean on
Yeah.
what's working, right?
Hmm.
Even if I'm also trying to find ways to give opportunities to other people on my team to be seen and heard as well. I mean, I think both are important, but you want to do it in a way that you're not like exposing, yourself to risk of the relationship or the project.
Right. Um, we have a few minutes left. Kind of want to transition maybe to a few final thoughts. One of them we talked about a little bit beforehand. We were joking around about, a tool is just a tool. We're not going to, get into exactly what you would use to help with this sort of thing. There's many ways you could go about that. Just research yourself. But one thing that has changed a lot in recent years is remote work. And there was a question that popped up around, all of this stuff that we're talking about. And we even said this in our group the other day. I remember it came up. We said, man, sometimes we forget how much remote work has changed this whole thing. We used to sit in an office together and talk about things and sit in a room with clients and talk about things. And that doesn't happen quite as often as it used to. So is there anything, I guess, that you've seen about the remote work aspect that has changed your thinking on any of this? Is it still just kind of fundamentally the same, or is there anything that we can do differently or to help do some of this stuff better in a remote setting?
Yeah. I think that, well, first of all, I've been working remotely since 2012. So,
Yeah.
and a lot of the stories in the book are from remote environments. I don't
Mhm.
necessarily clarify which ones are. Well, it'll be obvious which ones
Yeah.
definitely aren't, because there are definitely some that take place in person. And to be clear, you can't replace that in-person time. I mean, it is absolutely valuable, especially in terms of like building relationships with people. It is just easier to get to know someone when you're face to face with them,
Mhm.
right? Like that, it just there is
Yeah.
a uniqueness to the way you can relate to someone in person. That said, I have found that, I mean, I found async videos to be really valuable. So, well, you think of like a Loom style video. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be Loom. I use Zoom for it as well, or even just like QuickTime, right, with a couple of slides, right? So I think recording short videos for people as opposed to only sending a DM or an email can be really valuable. I think that assigning roles to people is maybe a bit more, or having specific questions for people might be more important on like a video call than in
Hmm.
person, where there's more body language to read about who is going to talk next, or who, how to, it's easy. It can be easier to jump into an in-person conversation, whereas on a remote call, when people are talking over it, and the natural delays that happen, it's kind of awkward. And so I find that having a little bit more structure in a Zoom call can be useful, whether I'm calling on someone to answer a question or having a very specific question about a part. Like, I think it makes that structure a little bit more important. But the advantage to it is that you can record um remote calls, right? You can get
Yeah, it's true.
transcripts,
Yeah.
right? There's all kinds of tools you can use. I don't know. I feel like I've gotten to the point now where I go like on a Zoom call, I can open up Miro, and we've got Figma, and there's all these things in the background, and here's my Google Doc, and I'll send you the link, right? And like I can switch screens and do that, and you won't necessarily, like, you still see my face the whole time, right? Whereas like then I go and I get in person and I'm like, wait, how do I share my screen in this room? And you can't see my screen, but now we got to switch to your screen, and we're not all on Miro, we're on an actual whiteboard. What use is that? How am I going to do anything with that? I can't put that in the computer. So
Yeah.
like I've definitely gotten to the point where I feel like those in-person meetings can be harder
You're
from a technology perspective. So
Yeah, you flipped complete. You're like totally, it's all remote for you. Yeah. And it's
I love being in person, but I have gotten to the point
yeah,
now where even for an in-person meeting, I might still encourage everyone, like, let's do this on Miro on our laptops as
right.
well, so that we kind of have a little bit of both.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the video. I had a colleague do that recently on Slack. Slack has a great, like, you just record yourself,
Hmm.
and it's so easy because you're in Slack all day. And he did that for us to explain something, and it was, I mean, it shouldn't have been mind blowing, but it was great. It was really
Yeah.
amazing. It was such a
even
good
the even
tactic.
the audio snippets that you can record, just a quick audio snippet, right? Like I don't know why I definitely hesitate to do it, but the times when people have sent them to me, assuming I have the attention span to listen to it, it's far more valuable than just seeing their DM, right? Because you kind of get a bit of that tone.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, we're coming to the top of the hour, so this has been, I mean, that was a fantastic conversation. And actually, I feel like we could have made it 2 hours and still kept talking, Tom. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you so much for joining us, and tell everybody, obviously, I'm sure many people know the book, but of course, you can get it anywhere, Amazon. Check out
Yeah.
Tom's site. If anybody needs any product design help, check us out. And we'll be doing this again soon. So please come back and join us again. Thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate your
Yep.
time.
Yeah. Thanks, you guys. Bye.
See ya.